Most people who come to Western esotericism eventually hit some kind of wall. They read the books, they learn the systems, they climb the degrees, and somewhere along the way, without fully noticing it, they have traded one set of abstractions for another. The phenomenal world, the raw, chaotic, living, embodied world has then been left outside. Today, I'm sitting down with David Beth, author, philosopher, magician, Hongan Esogwe of Haitian Vodou, founder of the pandemonic current and co-founder of the great Theon Publishing, alongside Jessica Grote. He is the author of The Black Pilgrimage, Chthonic Gnosis, and Vodun Gnosis, and his work draws from the Haitian Vodou, the thoughts of Ludwig Clogus, Heidegger's phenomenology, and traditions rooted in non-transcendentalist engagement with the world. In this conversation, we get into what is wrong with the Western esoteric model as it currently stands, why transcendentalism is the default setting of the Western mind, and why that default is costing us something real. What anti-transcendentalism actually means as a lived orientation. The difference between projecting a worldview onto reality and genuinely negotiating, participating with it. Why initiation through a living tradition cannot be replicated by a course, a degree, or a self-directed practice, and what that pandemonic is, what David Beth means by a daemonic self, and why the Black Pilgrimage is a movement back into the world rather than away from it. Now, this is the kind of conversation that actually doesn't leave you where it found you. Stay with it, feel it. It may take you somewhere you didn't actually quite know you were going. And if this conversation is landing for you, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who needs it. This is what this channel exists to do. This is why I'm here, and this is why I created it. To bring serious thinkers into the room and let the ideas actually move. And if you don't know, this is MagusintheMedia. Now, let's begin. Welcome back to MagusintheMedia. Everyone out there, I hope if you haven't, you will after this fantastic conversation that we're going to have today. I have the honor and the pleasure to be interviewing and conversing with David Beth of the Theion Press, this brilliant publishing company. They make amazing, beautiful, aesthetically pleasing books, as well as this man is an author, a scholar, a philosopher, a magician, and a mystic who is redefining, I would say, the edges, not only the edges, but where the edges, the abyss, and the soul truly meet. It is my pleasure to introduce you the author of the new book, The Black Pilgrimage, as well as many other books. David Beth, how are you today? And thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me. Well, I'm pretty good, but a little bit under the weather. So, if I'm going to be disjointed and rambling at one point, I hope your listeners will, take it as either crazy wisdom or the fragility of an aging man. So, I'm very good, though, and I'm happy to have this conversation today. So I'm looking forward to it. Thank you. And thank you for the acolytes.
Yeah, of course.
Great.
Yeah, anytime. I think it's important that when we have great practitioners and authors and people who are in the business to help give out such knowledge, that we give them the time and space to be able to talk about their work, especially because not everybody is always doing the great reading that needs to be done in this day and age for the kind of study. Before we get into your book, The Black Pilgrimage, I do want to just kind of have not only myself, but everyone else to get to know you a little bit. And the first obvious question would be, besides probably having a vast imagination, what was it that got you into doing exactly what you're doing, magic, mysticism, initiatory orders, and the like?
Well, I was born in Africa. I lived in Africa for many, many years. And it was literally the openness that my parents had probably towards African traditional religions and ways of thinking, as well as, I guess, my own openness to, digesting what I was witnessing in Africa while I was growing up. And my parents having lots of African friends who were also involved in art or, in one or the other ways spirituality, you could say, and being at a lot of these spiritual festivals and other things. And well, I guess I didn't have a lot of TV when I was growing up. African TV wasn't that great back in the days, and since I'm in my early 50s, it was not the time where you had cable TV with 100 channels. So I was reading a lot, and my father had a very eclectic library. Basically, my parents both had it. I mean, what was on vogue in the 70s, I guess, like, Life After Death, Allan Kardec, lots of philosophy, basically an entire library of, fringe thought and philosophy, apart from, anything else. So I was reading through a lot of that. And I've always been a person, I never grew up religiously. So my father grew up Catholic, my mother Protestant, but they kind of rejected organized religion and, didn't baptize us, to the disgruntlement of my grandmother and stuff like that. So I was never into like a religious upbringing. On the contrary, it was always philosophy, if at all, or, very religiously critical. So, I had a lot of experiences, during my upbringing, during my teens. I was never an outsider or anything. I was always very well liked and had lots of friends and very good social life and stuff like that. But, I always tended to question the state of reality I was in. I always had the feeling my friends would relate it to certain things, or certain things would be interesting to my friends, while I understood all of their business, like girl issues or life issues in general, sexuality and whatever you face as a young, teenager or whatever. However, while I also went through these phases and dealt with these things, it was basically, I also had other things that were occupying me, like, is the reality we're actually confronting the only reality there is? Are there other things behind that? And when I grew up in Africa, in Germany, my parents are originally German. In Germany, these questions weren't asked, because Germany is a very secular country, and very rational, post World War II especially. So and having been in Africa and seeing things like magic and bewitchment, even in our own household, like people worked for us, claiming to be bewitched and accusing other people in the household to having performed juju on them and stuff like that, and then trying to see how this all unfolds, and things you can't really explain. And also the openness with how people in these countries engage the, phenomenal world, but also, the brutal reality of life in a very different way than in the West, kind of fascinated me and made me question whether what the average Westerner was questioning in their own lives as the essence of life was actually what it was, or whether there was something behind it. So that was the beginning of my, questioning, you could say. And then, of course, you spiral into the usual orbits. You're into heavy metal, and I guess I didn't grow up. I'm still into heavy metal. So, you listen to Black Sabbath and, other bands, and they bring up Ozzy Osbourne and, the usual suspects. And, and then, strange things happen. You're like, I'm in Africa, I'm in Kenya, where I used to live, and, doing an internship with a German radio station, being alone in the country at that point. And I go to an Indian bookstore, tiny dirt hole other side of the road, not a big bookstore, tiny little, used books and stuff like that, paperbacks, that had water damage and stuff like that, this kind of smelly, stingy place, and I just look at the shelves, and there's like this big green book. So I pull it out, and I just look at it, and it's like the Confessions of Aleister Crowley. And I was like, holy shit, Aleister Crowley in an Indian bookstore in Kenya and Nairobi. That's, and I remembered, of course, Aleister Crowley. I'd researched a little bit about it, before the internet times. And I knew what Ozzy said about him and David Bowie, and a little bit of those anti-occult sources. Oh, yeah. And I said, I got to grab this book, because I have a lot of downtime during my internship. So I read that book in literally like 2-3 days. It's a big brick. And I was, and in my teenage years, late teens, I was like, man, that guy kind of expressed a lot of things I was thinking. Like, he was looking for answers, to questions he's had, even though it was a different time. And of course, gotta admit, of course, that, for a wild teenager like me, some of his exploits, they're kind of appealing to me. Like, he's a cool guy, in Victorian England, that guy is like a sexual adventurer and, an adventurer in real life, kind of mirroring the life of my parents and myself. My parents used to explore all over Africa, with me and my little sister kind of in tow. We would like drive around, like, the weirdest places, Niger, Chad, like for weeks at a time, like doing expedition, like, stuff. So, my parents had that side, which I inherited basically. So this were the early days of my formation as, oh, there is a pathway. And, he was looking for the hidden church, the initiates. And I was thinking, okay, maybe they are, people out there who are not like religious fanatics, organized churches of, Orthodox caliber, who have wisdom to impart, which may give me some answers to, whether there are other dimensions of life one can tap into in order to break open different experiences, or break open another layer, which then kind of make these experiences, give it more context than we have in the typical Western environment and how we explain the world. So this is basically how it began. And I was looking for, occult and esoteric orders and groups, and which wasn't easy before the internet, especially then, because I never lived longer than 4 or 5, 6 years in one country. So I didn't have colleagues, friends, or anyone who was into this, especially not in Germany. So, when I went then, like, to my last years of school, I went to boarding school in Germany for my last year of school or two, and then nobody was into that. Everybody was like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" Like, they're girls, or boys, whatever your orientation was. There's rock and roll, there are concerts, there's lots to do. Like, what are you, like, you're balancing a cup of water on your head because you read in a weird book? And I was like, you don't understand. So nobody was into this, except for me. So I was trying to like look for those things, writing to publishers, and nobody responded. It was kind of like that. It was kind of frustrating. And then, I did a lot. So I just kind of worked by myself. And this is how I later understood also how limiting this can be, just being a solitary practitioner. Of course, I bought all the Crowley books I could order by mail order, and everything I could get my hands on. My English was great, so I could read it in the original language. Didn't have to wait for German translation and stuff. So, but it was a good old days where you have to wait like months for a book to arrive. It was same as with the vinyl. You order a record, from America or from Japan, and it takes a long time. But then you're excited once it's there. And I kept doing everything like really focused. And it was only later when I went to UCLA to study. So I went for a couple of years, for a while I was at UCLA, where in corporate America, it was easier. So went to a bookstore, grabbed the Crowley book, and out fell kind of a business card from the hotel. Right. I was like, oh, the hidden church is not that hidden, But kind of, this is the route I went, So for a while I was associated with, the hotel and other things, and, and progressed from there. Being very quickly kind of disenchanted by the standard Western form of esotericism, this lodge-based esotericism, where I felt, one size fits all. The initiations are all formalized and standardized to a very strict degree, supposedly working for everyone themselves. Then you have the usual idea of ascent, purifying, things, basically mind over matter, true will, will to power, stuff like that, where basically the mental sphere and the abstract realm, or the connection to the abstract realm, was supposedly then enabling you to command the material world, which always seen or conceived of as lower, or as not as pure. Yes. And and so forth. So this was something that didn't sit well with me, since I've had so much life before, where I witnessed beautiful traditions that didn't see it that way, that didn't have it
Mm-hmm.
that way, where the world was engaged as is. The
Yes.
world was confronted in the way you kind of, experience it in everyday life. The phenomenal world basically wasn't considered to be flawed. It was considered to be inhabited. And you have to negotiate, the presences which you meet. So basically, that idea was always something that I had very strongly pressing upon, my inner world.
Yeah.
um, and then moved from the usual esoteric circles that you can find in the West to Michael Bertiou and his work, and I became the head of Michael Bertiou's groups, as probably some will know,
Mm-hmm.
the OTOA and the La Couleur Noire, and worked with them for quite a long time, and I try to reform it to a degree where, because of course, very quickly, once you work this, you understand it's also basically an esoteric form of German idealism. So you mentioned Husserl in our conversation before. Michael Bertiou he's a great philosopher, and he loves Husserl and Heidegger,
Oh, nice.
especially, however, Husserl and Hegel. So, he's basically a forgotten German idealist, if you so on. And his system is basically something which I would consider idealist to the extreme. And so, even though he uses a lot of conceptual language, voodoo and other things, which make it seem very earthy or very catonic, which it is in parts, but this catonic energy and vitalism is used especially to create mental worlds and, to propel the person into a very abstract mental realm, into which then he creates his own universe, then by absorbing the power of the phenomenal world, and then casting it back down. So, it's a
That's
very
beautiful.
specific idea, and however, directed to an extremely abstract idealism, and monadism. And when I was working with this and trying to kind of bring it back more to the roots of voodoo, I felt if I would continue doing it in the way I was doing it, it would basically literally completely take Michael Bertiou's system out of Michael Bertiou. And I said that wasn't my place. I mean, Michael Bertiou's system is a very beautiful system of philosophy and magical idealism, and I thought it should stay the way it was, because it is in itself a beautiful, especially intellectually engaging system, even though it's quite disjointed in many ways. But it is a kind of a treasure mine in case you're interested in magical idealism. So I felt I had to move out of this, and work with some of those initiates I had been working with for a long time, also in that area, in that environment before, because I felt the Western world especially, was lacking two things, like a tradition, like a living tradition, which basically would allow an engagement with the phenomenal world without any kind of transcendentalism
Mm-hmm.
imposed upon it.
Yeah.
Um, so it lacked the transmission of a living tradition, which would be able to facilitate this. And it lacked the system itself. So I had a lot of conversations with Jake Stratton Kent in the early formative years, when he started to investigate these types of non-transcendentalist paradigms, you could say. And it was probably due to my conversations with him, which pushed him into this direction. It was in the mid 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s, when he reappeared basically from his exile, his spiritual exile, and he was all through his career then very, and I have to give him kudos for this, always very firm on the necessity to often also attach yourself to a living tradition that provided a non-transcendental teaching, because we in the West are lacking this connection. And it's not enough to just study this as a scholar and then trying to fill in the missing links and
Yeah.
blanks,
Yeah.
because that's not the same. Otherwise, anyone who just theoretically learned things could just, I could be an architect by just reading a book on architecture, and
Yeah.
I wouldn't suggest you cross the bridge I built. So,
Right.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. Well, then that's also just doing the exact thing you're trying to get away from. If you're trying to get away from the transcendental by still only doing theory and mind work, you're laying yourself right back into the transcendental while having like a framework
precisely.
that's trying to, like, you're trying to lie to yourself by something you're doing it by, doing the opposite, it seems like.
Precisely. So,
Yeah.
so this is then when I went into, getting, so on one hand, I encountered, of course, also Western trends and traditions which were strongly non-transcendental through Michael Berthieu, the most idealist transcendentalist in that sense. He actually introduced me. Can you imagine? He actually was one of the two sources of introductions to Ludwig Klages, who was, influencing my Western conceptual non-transcendentalism. There was another route which this tradition took to kind of reach me, but Michael Berthieu was one of them, because he asked me once to bring him a book from Germany when I was visiting him in Chicago, and it was by Ludwig Klages, and I was like, oh, interesting. Yeah. So, but I felt like, well, there was this intellectual tradition, even in the West, which and Ludwig Klages is probably the most anti-transcendental, Platonic thinker I can imagine. I mean, much more than the late Heidegger or others, maybe Lawrence in some aspects could be. He actually read Cosmogonic Eros by Ludwig Klages.
Oh, nice. And, yeah.
It's actually on record that he did. So, I felt the need not only to develop a kind of conceptual thought which would reject this, transcendentalism and offer a kind of Platonic alternative, but I felt it of vital importance to reconnect myself to this. And my obvious choice then, which was not by me, but by the spirits themselves, was Haitian Vodou. I would have thought it's probably going to be, I don't know, West African Voodoo, because I lived in Nigeria for a long time. So I thought, that was probably going to be the route I was going to take. But eventually it turned out differently. And the spirits determined that I was going to be brought into Haitian Voodoo as a priest of Haitian Voodoo, and have a wonderful spiritual mother who then, opened her home in Haiti for me. And basically this is then how that came to be. So then I was able to fuse, and I can only say that when you're open enough, even as it doesn't matter where you're from, you can be from Asia or from the West, or from wherever, if you open yourself up to a degree. And for Westerners, however, especially Westerners from like a very strongly Westernized world, and it doesn't matter if you're white, black, or if you're from America or from Europe, you're strongly Westernized, and despite your heritage and despite everything else, you're very logocentric, you're very rationalized. The way you operate in the world is extremely
individualized.
Exactly. Yeah. Hardcore individualized and monadized, So, however, if you manage for some reason or other to open yourself up to these things, then initiation into these types of systems, if it's done right, if it's done, by the right people in the right context, if you're opening yourself up to it, and if the spirits call you to do it, which is always the basis of everything, and sometimes they don't. And of course, Westerners, we think, hey, we want this, so why would that not be open to us? We are genuine, right. We really are humble, we right. really think it's great. So how can they not accept us? We have that thinking of, entitlement. We're entitled to this because we want it so bad, or, we pay money, or, something because we're so great, we're so cool, we're such nice people. But this shows what you just said, this radical individualism and self-centeredness, which doesn't take any other force into account. Even something like it could be very, very non-beneficial to you if you do something you're not supposed to.
Yes.
But since we're so secular and we only think about esotericism as symbolic, we don't take it serious. and this is what I've seen, people jumping from tradition to tradition to tradition. You know, it's because they cannot allow themselves to really open themselves up to it. I mean, if you're into Buddhism, if you enter a Buddhism, there is so much there. You know, you have 5 lifetimes of studies and you still haven't scratched the surface, or you know, or whatever, Hinduism or Voodoo or anything, you know, that has a living tradition attached to it. But we in the West, we think, you know, we just look for the keywords, you know, for some of the kills and thrills, or material to basically facilitate our own little comfort religion and stuff like that. And which always shows me, if you do this, you do not have the afflatus or the real spiritual link. Because once you would have it, once you really undergo, let's say, a spiritual possession, like in Haitian Vodou or any other tremendous spiritual rapture, it would change your life so profoundly that you wouldn't have that boredom, you know, that people seem to constantly have, by constantly moving about and moving around and looking for the next, you know,
the next dopamine hit. Really, it seems like
rush, the next trend. You know, oh, today it's Kimbanda, tomorrow it's Voodoo, the day after it's Hecate, and the next thing is Chthonic magic, or you know, it's always a next trend that's you know, at the doorstep, and people seem saturated. And this is because no tradition has had the power to come through so strongly, because they haven't actually, most of them, of course, also by lack of possibility, they have not been able to attach themselves to one. And another thing that's lacking is a certain humility. You have to be humble to do this. You have to accept a master or a teacher, something that the West has extreme problems with. We accept teachers that you pay and that have to do certain things for you. And if they don't do it, you give them bad grades. You know, you rat them out at the university for being, you know,
hard and not obliging to your my grade. I deserve. Yeah, no, that's
you know these types, right?
I do.
This is, however, also the attitude you go into spirituality with, and you know, you have a lot of people catering to these people. There's a huge market of people selling all types of magical courses, and some of them are great. You know.
Yeah. I have massive problems with that as well. I personally,
But the thing is, you know, I mean, it's one thing to, you know, learn, let's say, magic of the PGM or other things. You know, you can teach these things. Yeah, this is what it. And I like the teachers who literally say, like, hey, listen, you know, this is what's in the PGM. I tell you what it's about, how they used to do it, and blah blah blah. You know, this is great. This is like, you know, applied archaeology in a sense, right? And people can learn this. But what it doesn't do is turn you into, you know, an initiate of the type that probably would have employed the PGM in its time, you know?
Right.
So we need to understand this, or any other tradition, right? So we think we can learn it by, you know, paying someone to teach us the secrets, you know, to spill the beans. And once we've written them down and we listen to them and we practice what they told us at home, then it makes us a magician, or, you know, a mystic, or a great initiate. You know, this thinking is absolutely and totally foreign to any living tradition. It doesn't, something like this doesn't exist. I've never encountered it in any living tradition I've encountered, and I've encountered a lot, from Sufism to Voodoo to, you know, lots of others. You know, I mean, I lived in Brazil for years. I lived in other places just to study these traditions and becoming initiated in lots of, especially African traditional religion and stuff, but also others that I've encountered in my life. None of them understand the idea that, you know, a college type course could provide you with the keys to unlocking the inner mysteries, or facilitate a type of mystical transformation the way Sufism speaks about it, or you know, Voodoo requires a certain transmission and empowerment for you to be able to even sustain the powers of the spirits, because otherwise they could shatter you into pieces, or you wouldn't even know how to like facilitate this contact in any way, unless it comes, you know, involuntarily. or within a setting where it's wished by and orchestrated by a priest or by you know, an initiate by family or something. So, you know, you understand my point, right? So this kind of thinking provides a lot of problems for people who have a genuine intent and a genuine maybe calling or need towards spiritual traditions. The modern world, which gives us the idea that everything is easily within reach. You have to you don't have to. Nobody can question you, really. You know, you don't have to be answerable to anyone.
Yeah.
A master or a mistress. You know, when I say master, I mean it, of course, you know, completely neutral of gender. My spiritual initiator in Haitian Vodou was a brilliant, or still alive, of course, she's alive, a brilliant woman who I respect deeply, La Belle Déesse. And so this type of humility to accept someone, to basically birth you, and not only wait for them to have done the job and then kind of like be whatever, you know, but in these traditions, it's understood that once you're born into this family of spiritual tradition, you know, you have a lifelong obligation, you know, to the spiritual family, to your spiritual mother or father or both, you know, and to your spiritual siblings, and your conduct and other things are important, because you don't want to bring disrespect and shame to the tradition or to your spiritual parents.
Don't want to be disrespect. I want to make sure I bring honor among my family, right?
Exactly.
That's the old Bushido samurai way.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, and in these traditions, you know, there is a degree, you know, depending on your grade of obedience, you need to follow rules, and a lot of things which I think these people you have mentioned, you know, these kind of self-entitled Westerners, and it's not that you know, it's not that they're bad people. We are raised like this. We are raised from the earliest age. You know, don't let anyone tell you who you are. You know, you're a great person. You know, don't let anyone twist you into whatever. And we always think a spiritual teacher is, immediately we think he's a manipulator. He must be. And why is that so? Because like attracts like. You know, in the West, you have a lot of charlatans, a lot of abusive people, a lot of people who you take advantage of your, you know, idealism, you know, that you want to be someone, you know, spiritual. And then these people, of course, you know, abuse their power and their station and, you know, their opportunities. But it's because, you know, they meet people who are also, you know, power hungry. They want to be someone. And it's flawed people.
Success-driven grifters.
Exactly. So you have a very unhealthy melange of students with an unhealthy attitude, or oftentimes an unhealthy expectation, and unhealthy teachers who actually feed this and abuse it. So, and of course, you know, there are a lot of vulnerable people that enter spirituality, because sometimes I think you have to be in this crazy world. You have to be a bit of an outsider. You have to have experiences which, you know, kind of made you question the reality you live in. And oftentimes, of course, these are experiences which leave traumatic experiences. And that needs to be taken into account. While at the same time, this is very often the case in the West. In living spiritual traditions, this can be the case, but often is not. Oftentimes people are very stable, very healthy, but they have lived in a community or in a world where these traditions are still powerful and are still, you know, kind of a mainstream, basically, experience. Mm-hmm. But in the West, unfortunately, you find a lot of people who are vulnerable, who are then exploited by people who smell out certain vulnerabilities. And this becomes a problem for everyone, you know?
We're on 100% the same page. And I was thinking while you're talking about how the difference is a big one that I see is how most people don't see that your professor, when you actually go to the academia or collegiate, which I rail on hard. I like to consider myself a Ronin or rogue academic myself. But the idea is that we forget that when we have a good master or mentor, advisor and as a professor, they are taking the place as the priest. They are taking the place as the magician at the head of the class, because you're going to them and you're every day and then they are, if they're a good professor, which most likely those good ones don't get tenured, but they're actually working hard with you to transform you and your thinking, which is different than those who sell coursework through the internet, because you're not actually in the room with your students. You're not taking questions that then help change their minds and help show them that maybe what they're doing is wrong. And so I find that there's such an interesting, this whole coursework, selling these things, leaving it up there to the discretion of the individual and their interpretation, which then leads us back into what I want you to help me define for our audience is this idea of the anti-transcendentalism, because I think that's a fascinating concept and something that I read in your book that we're going to get to here pretty soon, because we're bred and born as like maybe baby romantic occult esotericists, that we actually should fall into transcendentalism even more, because it's important to transcend your human mortality. But what I'm reading in your work and what I've heard you say is that actually we need to be okay with our mortality and the embodied experience. And so can you give me your views on the differentiation between the transcendentalism and the anti-transcendentalism here as we lead?
That's a very broad topic, but yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, you already nailed it pretty well. I mean, we are in our Western way of thinking, we have, since Plato and probably before, we have valued, I try to make it as easy as possible now without getting into these boring philosophical details, which probably most people, except maybe us and some others, may find a little bit nerdy and boring. But to kind of like try to make it easily understandable, we have been taught, and the thing is, not only taught rationally, we have embodied the approach to the world that the rational analytic approach to what we experience is basically the superior way of approaching things. The subject-object, discussion that's been ongoing and stuff like that. So transcendentalism here is, and you see it, of course, in all spiritual traditions of monotheism, especially, but in the West, in any spiritual tradition, even the pagan ones, and we can go into this a little later. It's interesting, and people need to be aware of this. So we have become so much located in our mind and in our way to analyze things. We project something onto the world we see, and immediately this has to conform to our concepts and our ways of, basically compartmentalizing what we approach to make it understandable. And so, of course, in spirituality, we find that this ladder of ascent, where we purify the mind further and further, where we become more and more pure from, in Christianity, of course, earthy thinking and sensuous experiences, and purifying our mind and orientating it to an abstract idea, goal, a kind of a moral high ground, or whatever you want to call it, or transcending the world to understand. I used to actually teach this many, many years ago, 30 years ago or something. I used to teach it myself because I'm also a Gnostic bishop, I was ordained in a Gnostic tradition, and in my first steps, as a Gnostic, I was very charmed by the criticism of the modern world, which Gnostics did in their time, and to try to explain the flawedness of the the world they lived in by saying, well, just an evil God could have created it, and with all their complex worldviews, however, there must be some transcendental, super transcendental God behind it, from whom we originate in some way or another, So I would actually all the Western schools and all the monotheist schools and others, they usually teach that by connecting yourself to that pure source, Ein Sof in the Kabbalah, or even transcending Kether, when you're managing to basically connect yourself to that ultimate source from which everything derives, including you. You understand that world, that life is just like a dream. You know, you're not real. You are the creator or spark of the creator. So basically, even going so far as to say, when you do it right, you know, you understand that you being in the world is literally a projection, a dream. You know, that you are the dream and the dreamer at the same time. I used to teach all of that really well, you know, and even teaching a lot of exercises with how you can actually find this out for yourself. So, you know, however, what this does is it either gives you a certain contempt for the literal world, the phenomenal embodied flesh and blood world that you live in, and you know, you kind of take a stance of you know, either like a posh rejection of it, you know, and you become like a traditionalist, you know, who will just reject it and think it's all kind of like, you know, a Tellurian you know, a scandal, or you do it more like Michael Burdi or others who say like, well, once you have cast your own reality down upon this world, you can do whatever you like, because, you know, it's just a projection, it's a playground, and, you know, it's not really real in that sense that that's the only realness that there is. So, you know, so it's a very, very problematic approach.
Which feels a little solipsistic, doesn't it not?
Absolutely so. So and so it basically, so what it does literally, it in any, whether you then become a libertine and engage in all kinds of crazy worldly things by saying, well, I can do this because I'm so far removed from it, you know, that it's okay for me to do it, because, you know, it's basically just the dream. I'm the dreamer and the dream, so I'm basically making the dream as lovely as it's possible. So it's like it's a dualism and non-dualism, you could say, right? And or whether you are a world rejecting, you know, mystic who goes to whatever, you know, his mental desert where he just kind of like contemplates himself as a drop in the ocean. You know, what you do, however, is you do not confront the world on its own terms. You know, you always project upon it. It's you who makes the rules. It's you who says the world is my playground, or it's a flawed place where if I remove myself enough, I can either ignore it and don't have to engage it, or if I do, you know, I make the rules and I'm the only one who does the rules. So you insulate yourself further and further, and do not allow the world to penetrate you in any kind of way, because penetration of the world means loss of control. Once the world impacts, so that's what you try to avoid. It's your will, it's your true will and your magical will. It's the will to power, you know, that you can employ to make the world subservient to your view. You create the world that you confront. You do not allow the world to co-weave it with you, you could say, right? Which is another way of seeing it. You do not negotiate the world, you know. You try in the crassest way, in the most, you know, also cowardice way, because of course I believe that people who have to kind of like so frantically go down this path, they're ultimately afraid of losing control, of losing themselves, and being afraid of what the world could do to them. So they are looking for a control mechanism, you know, and which even non-spiritual people do, right? Our entire world is created by trying to not lose control and having the control at all times, which then ties in what we said.
It ties in exactly what I'm saying. And it's fascinating when you're talking, because I can actually see the black pilgrimage coming out of you as it happens. Fascinating enough. And what I mean by that is, well, before I get to that, is that everything you just said is my problem with chaos magic and this postmodern magician.
Sure. Right on.
You know what I mean? And so then why I think it's fascinating is then to get us into this is that you're talking about something that is in the book, especially you're talking about, we don't want to cover over wounds. It is exactly what you're talking about. And the problem of postmodernism, the problem of chaos magic, is that all of this is actually covering over exactly the thing that is going to help us in our initiation in the world. And same as it sounds like people are creating boundaries when really they need to let these boundaries down and accept the existential angst of what this abyss is, this thing that we want to separate from ourselves, and maybe we only enter in it here and there, but the idea is that we're trying to get out of it. But that's not actually what you're talking about, is that we need to fully involve ourselves with the experience of the world, and in doing so, we can let our wounds show, and in doing that, we have enough courage to confront the existential phenomenal world, instead of separating ourselves into some kind of master of our own domain, master of the universe, which is actually detrimental to the universe itself. So it seems like what you're talking about with spirit and Geist, right?
Right. Well, beautiful said. I mean, I think even chaos magic at first, I'm very critical about it, and I have some friends, good friends, who are involved in it in some degree or another. However, I think the original idea maybe to break down these rationalist, paradigms, which keep us kind of, what Heidegger, would call it the Gestell, of the modern world, right? That is great. This idea, that we have to break down some of these, structures that keep us somehow enclosed into, in a world which is unhealthy. However, then they go off on a weird tantrum that everything is random, everything is weird. I have witnessed the weirdest things with them, right? With chaos magicians in I don't know, whatever. Yeah, Minnie Mouse is is a goddess, and stuff like that, which is nonsense for me. However, the certain idea that is at the root of it was really good. However, where it went was a kind of was down a very dark path, totally away from the true immersion and respect for the world. It was truly a disrespect to the world, not only to the boundaries, in my opinion, but it was, in this whole postmodernism, I do not find a lot of value in this postmodernist thought. It actually leads, if you really follow this rabbit hole down, even deeper into the enframing of this Heideggerian enframing, while at the same time kind of glamorizing you into thinking you're actually out of it, which is the worst, right?
Yes. You're entrapping yourself deeper into the panopticon.
Exactly, while at the same time thinking you're totally carefree, right? So while I do know a lot of chaos magicians who are great people and also wonderful thinkers and stuff like that, the system in itself absolutely, for me personally, is nothing I could follow myself for many reasons, and you said those, the ability to confront the world as we find it, and to understand that not even in a romantic Western sense, oh, the world is alive, oh, the world has a soul. This kind of infantile romanticism you cast upon it is another trap. So, let's try to go through this route. There is a good big trend which says monotheism is boring, it sucks. Oh, we have even in the Grimoire tradition, I love this. This is my favorite, when they say oh well, we have treated the demons real bad. We used to put them in a triangle, and then we kind of coerced them into doing our bidding. As if any modern magician could literally put a demon in a triangle and coerce them, as if they're literally, a Solomonic legend. I mean, I've seen a lot of, in my time, I've seen a lot of magicians, in triangles, in circles, casting things in triangles, and in the end, they also said, well, it was in the astral, right? And it looked totally. It was. I've witnessed another ridiculous amount of nonsense. Okay, to be very blunt. So and now you have these trends where you say well, we have actually treated these demons real bad, they're not bad people, so we shouldn't actually put them in a triangle and whip them into obedience. No, we should actually treat them as our friends. Now this is the same with this modernity in general, social environments. We've been so bad, now we have to do it totally different. It's a very neo-colonial attitude, that you impose your sentiments, your current state of moral justice, right or wrong. You impose it on all the environments that you are experiencing in your life, right? By doing that and thinking, I'm totally out of this paradigm of imposing my will, because this is what we Westerners do. We impose our will on, I don't know, marginalized people, on demons, so whatever we do in the real world, we also do on the spiritual world, and we need to stop it. So while this has a good root, in my opinion, a positive agenda at the root of it, people don't realize what they're doing is basically projecting their own sense of right or wrong onto the world they are engaging with, right? So they don't look at the reality, like, how is it, and how do we need to negotiate it? And how do we work this out, right? So no, they project moral sentiments and sentimentalities and other things of their current logocentric, mental, Western sense of right or wrong, onto these things, and thus not allowing that world to step forth and then negotiating it, right? So they remain entrapped. And now we have this weird trend where the demons are considered friends. Oh, the goddess Hecate, she's such a nice woman, and Kali too. We no longer have to sacrifice dogs and things, like they did in ancient times, because we know better. And no, she told me it's no longer necessary. Things change over time, and now it's this, And while I respect a lot of people engaged with all of this, don't get me wrong. I mean, I overdo it now, just to make my point.
We have to.
But this, because I'm trying to make that point, because it's serious in consequence, right? Yes. And while I always, and I need to say this, while I do not want to patronize anyone, everyone can do whatever they want, as long as they don't annoy me in my work. It's whatever you do is fine with me, But if someone asks me, that's what I'm going to say, right? So then I have to make a point that I think, from my perspective, is important and valid. So, when I think now people stepped from, casting demons in a triangle and coercing them, now demons suddenly are rendered like, hey, they're friendly people. And I'm thinking, wasn't there a reason why they may be in a triangle? Were they, Yeah. And it's like, no. So, and then you can say only a person who's never actually kind of like engaged with a real spiritual entity can think you can just randomly say, well, before people were stupid and mean, so they did this because that was their agenda. They treated, Western white people treated like everybody else like shit, So also the demons were treated like shit. Well, obviously in other cultures this was the same way, I mean, it's not that the jinn were treated really well or something, by Solomon. So, in the end, a lot of traditions did it a certain way, monotheistic traditions I'm talking about now. And now, however, we are doing it another way. So randomly saying like, we were bad, not the demons. We just treated them bad.
Yeah.
And even when demons were supposedly described as malicious, angry, dangerous, mind or soul shattering, now this is not taken serious, because you know why? There has been such a long time of secularism and of, explaining occultism in terms of psychology. Oh, it's all Jungian, it's all archetypes, right? Like Jungian psychology and occultism are the same. I've heard people say, it's very smart people. They say like, well, I'm explaining Selima or other things, in terms of Jungian psychology, whether you're meeting spirits or magical beings, or whether you're describing it as archetypes or archetypal beings, is the same thing. And then I'm thinking like, wow, we've really gone down a very, very strange road, right? Mm-hmm. This can only happen in a world where real spiritual engagement has not happened for a very long time for most people. Yes. You know what I mean? Yes, where we can psychologize things and mentalize them to such a degree that we render them basically mental constructs of our own minds, or even shared collective, obsessions or something like this. So we need to understand what we're doing here is basically devitalizing these things and basically robbing them of a certain enthusing quality of their own, a certain type of atmosphere which they can impose themselves if one is open enough or fragile enough to actually experience it. And our world teaches, do not be fragile, do not experience it, enclose yourself, and that's why most people think magic is a hoax. That's why most rational people I know, in Germany, think when you tell them you're doing occultism or you magic, even they think you're stupid. They think you're like a child.
Oh,
in England they were a bit more open, but they're more eccentric anyways. So, the society in general. You're conjuring demons. Oh, that's really.
That's cute. That's cute. And it's
that's cute, darling.
That's exactly, and that's because it's true. It's because we have a bunch of spiritual adolescents out there playing as warlocks and witches when really they are just playing with their toy action figures in a room that they've conjured to be a temple, which I find to be ridiculous.
Exactly. When I was young, I was questioning all of this already, and then I would try to make certain experiments. I would have a group of people come together to do rituals, right? I was even when I was in my late 20s, I was quite well known in the area. So I had people come around, and I would do hoax rituals. I would say tonight I'm going to do a very powerful ritual, which I've inherited from, whatever, Michael Burry or someone, and then I would do a total shit show. Really, literally, I would invent it on the spot, making sure nothing works and everything is completely nutters. And not even chaos magic, fun nutters, but sounding very serious and sounding right. But when you really dig deeper, it was nonsensical. And everyone was and whether you did a real ritual, everyone was wow, it was so deep. Oh, this experience was so profound. I had this and that experience. I was thinking well, there you go. It's psychology. It's self-fulfilling prophecy. It's creating a deep, of course, you do the incense and you do the invocation. You create a certain atmosphere, and people want to have an experience, and so they'll have it, And everyone knows these kind of things. And this for me was always a problem. I always had to think how can one know the difference, of this? So these were always part of my quest, And but maybe back to the original question was the transcendental world, is that what we just described? A world where even if you have now the idea you want to be an animist because you think that sounds more fair, or you want to be a polytheist, but animism now is the big new trend, right?
Paganism and paganism as well.
Yeah, paganism, especially with an animist trend.
With an animist trend.
Yeah, the world's alive. Oh, the world is alive and everything is. And I connect
folklore, that folk tale, that kind of folk magic.
But what happens is what we just said. What happens is while the idea is okay, is great. Hey, respect the environment. I'm an environmentalist. It's great. But you impose a very sentimental thinking upon the spiritual world. You now want to be true. This wasn't true because it didn't fit my agenda. Now there are still other people who say well, no, this environmental occultism is nonsense. This kind of, weird hippie-esque, animism that Westerners are playing at is stupid. Oh no, we're still going the, traditional road, And so you have two competing, or 3 or 4 or 5 or 20 competing factions, which say their mental projection on how the world should be is the better one. Right,
it's that relativism, moral relativism that we're continually pushing everywhere. Yeah,
there you go. And whoever is morally correct, or your peer group, you enter the stream which your peer group is more powerfully vocal in, and then usually you do that, right?
And it's crazy because they're arguing against colonialism while also being colonialist in that. Doesn't it seem that way?
Same. It's exactly that. I mean. It's the craziest thing. I have so many friends in Haiti and in Africa and stuff like this. And it's could white people stop, trying to talk for me? Could they stop, saying, it's
that
they treat us
nonsense.
You can't, white people telling other white people, you can't do that. That's going to be this. And then they're like, and then my Haitian friends or my African friends is dude, we can, if we have an issue, we'll say it, but it's this neo-colonial attitude. They say they're like children. They can't defend themselves, And all my Haitian friends or Africans or Afro-American friends or something, they're dude, of course we can defend ourselves. I mean, if we have something to say, we're gonna say it, and we're gonna say it in a way you fucking understand, but we're gonna say it, or whatever, any marginalized group or whatever, it's this entitled neo-colonializing attitude of like, we know better, we tell you what the world has to be like, this is how it's supposed to work, and if you do not agree, you are this, that, and this happens the same in esotericism often, and it's a very problematic path.
It's disgusting, and that's something I feel like the many different avenues I'm taking with my work, my channel, and things like that, and and interviewing brilliant minds like yourself and Scarlet Imprints and Peter Mark Adams, I feel like there's this like through line. And then what's nice is that I feel like just like in the normal everyday world, the Western esoteric occult community also forgets its Luciferian Promethean spirit, that like it's important to bring the fire to all things, right? INRI, all of nature must be renewed by fire. And the occult community is just as much needs that, because it's been infiltrated by weak-minded charlatans that, funny enough, who may follow Thelema or may follow Gurdjieff or may follow whatever it is, but they've completely forgotten what these Luciferian spirits are for.
Exactly. You know what occultism or esotericism in the West has become is ideology. It's ideologues. Ideologues who defend their ideology against all odds and against, and not even minding the cost. So this is what it is. My ideology, my view of the world, and none other. And then you have 1,000 infights, and that's why every group splinters into 1,000 fractions. I'm right. No, you're right. Oh, this letter was misinterpreted, and you can see it's an intellectual combat, mostly, like you said, on a very low level of intellectual forte.
Yeah.
So, and this is because we have lost a living tradition, that people can have even initiatic experiences in. I mean, in other living traditions, of course, you have initiations when you reach puberty, when you reach a certain stage in your adult life, and every time, you are being placed as an individual into the relationship with the world. You learn how yourself, the wider tribe or community, work in relationship with the wider cosmos, and how this interacts, and what your place is in it, what your opportunities and your possibilities are, how you can negotiate these things. We've lost all of this. I mean, at best we have communion or these kind of like, churchly things where we do it, most children I know do it because they get presents, but they don't want to go to Bible school and Sunday school and stuff like that, but they do it because they're going to get a computer or, they're going to get a PlayStation or something.
Yeah, no, that's funny. And what I find fascinating, and then I wonder what you think, and I already know that you, and especially because you hit it home in your book and in your talks and everything like that, how important it is to have a master or a teacher. However, there is this strange thing about initiation in the esoteric community, because I feel like there's a lot of gatekeeping in the institutionalized occult world, like the Golden Dawn or the OTO or any of these institutions want to say the only way you are a magical individual or that you can do magic is to be initiated in my way. And my way is the Golden Dawn, and my way is the OTO. Thelema, whatever it is. And I just wonder what you think about that, because I know myself how important it was that I had my professor that I was telling you about before, who had his lineage that went back into Husserl and Heidegger. He was, Aristotle and these things.
Magus of Meskish.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. As well as then I myself, a martial artist. And so I also have a golden thread that leads me through from my teacher all the way to the Chinese guys, the Filipino guys that
you
I've
understand
trained
it
from.
then. You understand that importance.
It's so important. But I also understand how hard it is to find good teachers and masters in institutions, because it's almost like, what do you do as a solo practitioner in a world? Is there a way to... And what I think, now that I'm talking about it, it seems like you can find them. It's just, it may not come from the magical institutions themselves. What do you think about that?
It's a very tough question. And also, I think it's a very problematic answer I'm going to give, because it is a plight, right? It is a very problematic status quo we have. So, I do believe, like, professors, like you said, like if you have a professor that goes in direct lineage to the Magus of Meskirch, Heidegger himself, and that professor was someone who took it so serious. I think someone who's met Heidegger in his later years, for example, will understand the idea of transmission, right? And how you kind of alchemically need to work with a student in order to prepare them for the deeper, Heidegger would say, the deeper questioning, right? Because in my opinion, questioning in that sense of Heidegger was his, mystical operation of, getting deeper into things and getting, kind of constantly not staying within the status quo, but constantly questioning yourself, the world you're in, the relationships you forge, and so forth. So I believe if you're lucky enough to find a intellectual teacher on that level, where philosophy is no longer just abstract intellectual game, but becomes, the Thea Philosophia,
Thank you. Yes.
the holy way to kind of like reach the source of things without defining what the source is, the encirclement that Heidegger talks about, the nearness to the source. If philosophy is applied philosophy as an action, and in this action is not the action of imposing a will, but to keep an openness towards what comes, right? I talk about it in the like pilgrimage in different ways, but this openness, to remain open and not insulated, to allow things to come without, prefiguring or conceiving what should be coming, right? Because we say, oh, well, I'm open for, good things to come to me or things to come to me, but we already define what you really want to come. And once you're doing that, you're already kind of coloring the experiences you will be having. So, we can see, even though we want to be animist, we want to be open, we want to be different, the way our mind works, the way we have been raised for generations has created this quasi-parasitical necessity to render the world or to how do you call it, like to devitalize the world, to project expectations, to project our mind onto what is supposed to be happening or how we see things in front of us. And no matter the paradigm we adopt rationally to the animism today, because it's it's more kind or this or that, it is not helping you to drop the inner logocentrism. It does not help you to drop the inner insulation, which would render you so porous that the world can flood in that vital, meaningful way that suddenly will transform you so strongly that you will never be the same. And I think if you have no teacher to help you create, on one hand, the porosity, and then help you navigate the flood of incoming torrents, you will either immediately reject it and close it off and start to devitalize it and try to render these experiences according to your preconceived idea of the world or how it should be like, because you have no references also in order where to place such experiences. This is another issue, right? So I really believe if you're a Westernized person, and a Westernized person can live anywhere in the world, it doesn't have to be in the West. You can live, you can live in Africa and be a super Westernized person, or you can live in Asia, wherever, it doesn't matter your skin color. It's
a mindset. It's the modernity mindset.
It started in the West, but it spread worldwide. It's a worldwide issue. So it's a global issue. And to reverse the alchemy of not striving for more and more and more power over things around us, and striving for more, because even the people who want to have an animist world where everything is so kind and so nice, they want this because they feel threatened by the other way. Maybe they can't cope, maybe they can't operate in it so well, so they reject it and want another way. And so within their community, there's a consensus. This is how it should be like, and this is what we find. Now I'm going to go into nature, and the spirits are talking to me, and then I'm thinking like, this is what they're telling you, the sentimental rubbish, In Africa or in Haiti, they think like, what the hell, the spirits are not always kind, There are spirits which are so cruel, that you wouldn't even understand what they could do, and also what you must do sometimes in order to deal with them. There are some spirits you need to chain up, and you need to do this because when you're able to work with them, or when they impact in a certain way, you have to do this very carefully in a very, very, very precise way. Your magical technology needs to be very precise in order to know how to do it, because these things cannot move unchecked, right? But this is outside the scope of most people, and it's not because, and often I see a very good motivation, right? A very good motivation, seeing that the way the world works, this, the will to power, which is basically rampant in the world in every aspect of the way we live. Even with the do-gooders. The do-gooders say, we don't think this world is good. However, what they do, of course, is they mob and, digitally lynch everyone who's not, up to their standards or their opinion, or, they go, even like whatever, Kant, or so, Kant in his private letter to said that word, which was like, they don't think that Kant in his time, thought about things in a certain way, or Crowley or whatever, you can criticize it all, but to intellectually be so weak as to not understand that people in their own time, maybe lived in a different environment, and said and did things which we now, for better or worse, find horrific, oftentimes also for better, find horrific now, must be seen in context. But of course, that's an intellectual exercise that's I guess often too much for some people, and they can't have it, So the idea to render ourselves porous enough so that the world, in all its violence, in all its beauty, in all its overwhelming power, can flood in, and we are willing to give up some of that control, that is extremely difficult. I mean, Bataille even talked about it and tried it, there's the Acephale group, and, he even went as far as saying we have to have a human sacrifice, otherwise we can't kick into that mindset, Well, I guess thank God they kind of like, took a step back from that when nobody wanted to be the sacrifice, I guess,
and of course,
it's usually like that, right? But they understood that, what can we do as Westerners to facilitate that breakthrough, that rendering us porous enough so we not immediately fill that wound, that openness which is created, that scar which lets things flood in, and we need to insulate it because it conflicts with our idea of the world. It conflicts with how we want things to be like. It conflicts with our way of controlling things, and we're always afraid to lose control, afraid of death, afraid of losing, loved ones and family and whatever relations. So going back to the teacher question, I think what is lacking is teachers who teach the right things, but also teachers who have experienced themselves those things they're teaching to the degree that makes the teachings powerful and that work. And I think if you haven't been associated with a living tradition, or maybe with a teacher who has been exposed to one, who then works with you in the way you explained it so well, basically, that works with like a philosopher who takes the Theophilosophia serious, who works with you like a apprentice, who creates an alchemical change by sharing a certain sacred space together, and by you as a student allowing this to take place, you need to find someone that you trust more than yourself. That's how I think about it. In certain moments that are crucial, because in crucial moments, you will reject the teacher. It's like, well, what he's saying is, I went along with all the things, but then you secretly understand you went along with everything you really thought was okay. right? The moment the guy or the girl will tell you something that deeply conflicts with the way you see things, you will find all kinds of reasons why they're fraudulent, why that's not okay, why you don't need it, why others may, blah, blah, blah. So I learned from Sufism, before even I learned this from Haitian Vodou, that, the teacher is a physician of the heart, and the heart as the, center of spiritual enlightenment. You need to allow the physician to operate on this heart, and you need to love him more than your parents or, the people you hold dear, because he is the person who brings you closer to God in Sufism, right? Yeah. And the sense of, well, I can do this by self-initiation is a problem because, of course, you have in your mental head so many projected ideas of how things should be like, that you will, of course, shape things according to your, inner needs. And, you even may feel proud, oh, well, I did that, and that was such a sacrifice. But you do this because you feel that sacrifice was needed in order to feel good about yourself, right?
Right.
And in Sufism, there's so many spiritual tales and so many spiritual teachings clad in stories which talk about these people, who think they make these great sacrifices because they really want to. But when, the teacher gives them a task which is so outside of their scope of right or wrong that they will fail, and then it was just a test, whether they have it in them or not. So I really truly believe that in the modern world, there are very few teachers who qualify in this, in what I believe a teacher must accomplish. He must also have time for a student. That's why, for example, in our tradition or my tradition, I cannot I cannot have an international community where I mail order teachings and that's it. Or where, I say, well, I give initiations astrally, or, this kind of stuff,
Utter bullshit. It's utter bullshit.
Exactly. So in the tradition, in the primordial way, in the cosmic gnosis, it's there can only be a certain amount of students, there are only a certain amount of teachers who can work with students to a certain degree, there always must be availability, and there must be a process where you check each other out and where you see whether it's right for you or not, whether, and it's a gradual process. But in the end, what will determine whether you are going to be successful is whether you're going to find a teacher which is genuine, which has time, and also the patience to work with your also often setbacks. And oftentimes, of course, and you cannot look for a teacher who's a pure embodiment of your personal projection of what a teacher be like. Is another thing, another bullshit thing I learned from the Sufis. A teacher, is himself a human being with all his, sometimes troubles and bad moods,
problems,
issues and stuff like this. However, he has, in many ways, calibrated himself in a certain way that allows a transmission to take place, an alchemy to work, and he can prepare you in a certain way. And that is why even when the Sufi student, once he becomes a master, may eclipse his master in fame by much, will always probably link his success to his master. Say like, well, I'm nothing without the teachings I have received from this master. Otherwise I
levels of humility. Yeah, levels of humility.
And this humility is not this humility that you have because you want people to say like, wow, you're so humble.
Right, you're not name dropping people.
Exactly. And this isn't, I always thought it so funny that I remember when I lived in America, and people in, for example, the OTO, they had their OTO certificates all like framed at the wall. I thought that was so weird. I mean, hi everyone who remembers me from back in, if you have your certificate on the wall, it's great. Why not? But I thought it was strange.
It's strange.
Everybody should see their accomplishments. Right.
Well, let alone who fucking cares if you're in the OTO? I mean, really, especially in this day and age.
Replace OTO with your Masonic charter or something.
Right. Yeah.
You can, you can see people love other people to, acknowledge their greatness. People always thought it was so strange that I would never have any of this up in my rooms. Nobody knows my degrees except for people I know very well. I don't go around telling everyone, oh, I was the grandmaster of this and the sovereign grandmaster of that, or very few people even know that I'm the head of my own, not my group, but the group that I'm now heading, because it doesn't matter. A master is not a master because he has achieved something that he can put at the wall for other people to admire. A master is the most exhausting servant of the community. And if he's not, he's bullshit.
I like that. I do know. I like that, because your mastery should be presented in the way you walk, the way you talk, the way you it's in your eyes. I like that about like the Chinese, like in my training of like martial arts and stuff. It's like the battle begins right away, not with the words, but the way you look at the other opponent. And you know what I mean? Or when you're speaking or debating or whatever it is.
Totally true. So, like if the teacher or the master is not ready to do the hard work, where you can see he's busting his ass harder than anyone else, if he's there pontificating and having other people tell him how great he is, or if he, tries to, like, I don't know, he charter trades the entire time with other people who have fancy degrees, which is another disease in the spiritual world. I mean, you have no idea how many times I was, asked to trade, I don't know, episcopal transmissions and charters with all kinds of people, jurisdiction here, jurisdiction there. This whole shit doesn't interest me at all. Like, I think the work we do is so unique. I cannot share jurisdiction there. It's so ridiculous and stupid. This politics in esotericism, it's about spiritual transformation and not jurisdictions, and not some type of social applause. And this is what most people forget. And also, however, the students forget it. The students go into occult orders where you have to brown nose your way up. You have to know the right people, and it becomes this whole typical, social playground where, oh, this person was an ass. Oh, he was promoted. Why was he? I'm more smart than him, blah, blah, blah. Because, it's encouraged. These groups, they pretend not to encourage it because, of course, they're all spiritually super experienced and humble and developed. But at the same time, it's what happens. In a logocentric world, this is what will happen. Like in the golf club. Oh, why was he elected president, not me? So it happens everywhere. It's like jealousies amongst people. And this is when this happens, when there is a very certain type of steep hierarchy that's based on formalities. And if there is not this kind of living traditional family idea of how you deal with each other, like the way I handle things in my spiritual environment is more like a spiritual family. There are, of course, you have to have the reverence and the respect for your elders, for the people who have gone before you. You may even be much smarter than someone who's been there a long time. But
it's natural hierarchy. It's a natural hierarchy.
But you have to learn not to allow this cleverness that you have, and that may help you, basically get the better of you and say, like, well, I'm much smart. I should be like promoted much quicker than I don't want this guy. This kind of weird competitive thinking within spirituality is ridiculous, because everybody, the way I see the word, the Black Pilgrimage says it, it's an individual, and here comes the true individuality. It's not this false individuality we have seen in the insulative, with the insulating individual. The true individuality is how you correspond with the world, how you and the world move together in a certain rhythm, and how you calibrate yourself towards it. It has completely nothing to do with the advancement of others, or whether the calibration of others is in this stage of calibration, and have they managed it or not. It doesn't matter to you, because, they are they and you are you. If someone has achieved something in the way, maybe because they're happy, or, their life is ecstatic because, they managed to plug in a certain way, has no effect on you, because you're in your own way, and you're in your own life, you're in your own stage, right? So, however, if you have these very formal degrees, which gives you certain powers over others, suddenly you're back in the real world that you know for since you were a little child. Suddenly it's like, oh, if I'm a 9th degree of this, then I get a lot of respect. then I get a lot of, you know, I can drop this everywhere I go, you know, and I can be humble by not saying it out loud and write it on my forehead. But in conversations, I may kind of mention.
I may dribble here or there.
Exactly. So basically, you know, you encourage people to fight for degrees, to fight for position, because it gives power over others. And the idea of having powers over others in that formal sense is very, very damaging. At the same time, what is damaging is just a kind of hippie-esque group of friends hanging out, a discussion group. Then it becomes this random, you know, oh, you know, we're all equal, we're all having a good time. Aren't we all on the same path? I could totally not disagree more. You know, I would have this about, oh, what you said was so interesting, but I think we're all on the same path, are we not? I was like, thank you for saying this, but however, we're not. You know?
We're not.
We have to, and it doesn't. It's not meant bad, but you know, not all roads lead to some spiritual realm. You know, yours probably lead out there. You know, and mine leads in there. You know, so in the end, this is what we have to realize. I think, you know, form a hierarchy that's based on these traditional formalities, by stages which lead you by degree outside the world where you have to be responsible to something or someone, are problematic, because they will claim that the more you need not to be responsible because you have achieved the higher degrees where you are kind of detached and even more insulated, even as a magician or as a mystic, will give you power, not only in the tradition that you're in, but also over the world. So once this spiral keeps happening, we are already in that mindset in our real life, right? And when this happens in spirituality, it becomes, you know, intensified in a very bad way.
Yeah.
Right.
It's that spiritual egotism that
exactly, and that then kind of really runs rampant in a very bad way, oftentimes. You know, and then this explodes groups, because suddenly you think you're much cleverer than anyone else, and you know you have other people who are disgruntled by their, you know, slow advancement because the cliques have decided to move other people ahead, or something.
High school cool kid nonsense that I can't stand.
Maybe you're just fucking stupid and they don't want to raise you, you know, but you think you're super clever. I've seen this all. It happens this way or that way. And then you and your other disgruntled friends are like, well, you know, fuck these guys. We have all the secrets in a book. So now we're going to do our own group. You know, and suddenly you have the group which have like lofty ideas, like, well, you know, these people gatekeep. So now here we are. And however, nobody in that group wants to be an Indian. They all want to be the chief. Right?
That's so true.
So then you have like, you know, a group of 5 people, and then they say, oh, who's going to be the boss now? But I want to be. So like, okay, you be the boss, but I be another type of boss. And then they have like, and then they're looking for sheep, right? Like we have 5 bosses who broke away from this. We have all the secrets, but we're not going to be as stupid as them. And now you can be our student, you know? And then the same bullshit happens, right? So
hilarious.
There needs to be some responsibility. You need to be ready to be responsible to someone. But the environment needs to be set up in a way that can cater to individual needs, individual constellations of personality, you know, meaning it cannot be formalized to that extreme degree. A system has to be flexible. The only way voodoo could survive being shipped from West Africa to, the New World was basically by its flexibility, by being able to, you know, adapt to new needs, you know, not to say like, well, you know, this is the specific plant we need for this recipe, but, you know, this thing like, well, this plant does this in the big picture. So we can find another plant in Haiti, which may be cold, hot, or whatever the, you know, ingredient of the plant must be like. You know, and we could absorb other traditions. So, you know, voodoo in Haiti is not the same as voodoo in West Africa, but, you know, it has, you know, become a very beautiful melange of influences, however, not randomly, but specialists, you know, have created what the Sufis call lawful change, you know, and lawful change cannot be, oh, I've read about voodoo, so I'm going to do my own voodoo cult. Because I've read about it and I feel like the spirits are calling me for some reason, so I'm going to do it. So, you know, I can do something. I can create innovation in voodoo because I've been initiated to the highest degree of the Assange lineage in Haitian Vodou. So I could say, well, here in Germany we need to do things in a certain way, or my temple does it a certain way, or something like this. I can do that, but only according to very specific rules that need to be observed in order for the things to function as they need to function. You know what I mean?
Yes. Well, you're the microcosm of the universe, because the universe runs itself off of certain rules.
If certain spirits need cooling because they're so hot in nature, let's say, and in Haiti they would use like certain things to cool them down, and if I don't have the exact same things here in Germany or whatever, I can, however, find replacements which will do the same job. However, if you don't know the exact way this needs to be worked and dealt with, you cannot do it. Then it becomes random and it becomes like weird.
Well, that's how people turn into raving lunatics, is because they're starting to do things and they don't understand that everything, it's not a separate world. Everything that you do in your ritual is then, the ritual isn't just in your temple, it's out in the world.
That's right.
And so everything you do there, it has an effect on your mental states and your modes of being.
Right. That's right.
I think that's widely forgotten.
So the funny thing is, very often they don't have real spiritual contact to something. However, in their mental projection, they do have it, and they feel things, and things happen. Yeah. That's why you see all these raving lunatics. These guys will go mad, because they get obsessed with things. But what they get obsessed with is the mirrors of their own projection, demons, spirits, whatever. They find it there, and then these things. And of course, there is an effect from the outside world. But the outside world, however, doesn't perfectly always mirror what you want. So things become distorted. So, and then you're not equipped to deal with it. And also your neediness to be someone, your neediness to have some type of positive effect for your life.
Which is a demon that should be put in the triangle, the neediness.
There you go. There you go. This is a very good point. This is the worst demon because it's the demon of wanting to have success and a better life. And, you will do whatever it needs, to make this happen in your head, even if you have to completely lie to yourself to a degree where everything is distorted. And you and I, we've been around the block for long. We have seen so many people in the Western esoteric traditions who are completely fuck-ups, if someone tells me, well, I've done magic 25 years and I'm super successful and everybody buys my books. However, I'm totally broke as fuck. I have no, like my personal life is fucked. I'm totally unsuccessful in whatever. And
your health, right, is the biggest one.
Your health is the word. Your health. Once this is funny, man. Once I was in America. I gave a talk at a conference which was like well stocked with good, intelligent, famous people, and I gave a talk, and I took a woman with me whom I happened to stay with, who had nothing to do with occultism. It's like, oh, I'm going to give a talk. You want to go? It's going to be kind of fun, hang out in like weird circles. That's how you tell them. And I was like, yeah. And then I swear to God, we stepped into this room of like the vanguard of the New Age, right? Big magician. The speakers, I'm not talking to speakers, I'm talking about the audience, right? Who, of course, think of themselves very often as advanced initiates, like people with a spiritual depth and quite a command, of the realms, And they think about people who are not initiated or something as the dross, right? The capo.
Yeah. The muggles.
The muggles, the underman. And then this woman, and like literally 10 minutes after stepping in this room, she just took me aside, like, David, for me, it was like stepping into a rehab meeting.
Oh, that's good.
She said, like, those are the most unhealthy looking people I've ever seen, like mega obese, like tooth missing, You could see like recovering alcoholics, drug addicts, and everyone has their plight,
Of course.
Some of my best friends are recovering alcoholics, but what I'm trying to bring across is these were the people who haven't dealt with their issues, right?
Oh, yeah.
They were like, oh, Crowley was a drug addict, and he indulged, so as long as I'm like having it under control and the spirit tells me I should like, snort a few lines before my ritual to Horonzon, it's totally, Horonzon is going to burst through even harder, This is the shit I had to deal with, in my life. So,
Yeah, of course.
you know,
That's good.
and it was like, whoa, David, where have you, you know, what circles have you roamed in? Like, this is the cool circles. The other ones are even worse, you know?
Yeah,
So,
that's
yeah, you know,
no,
so
that's
she,
hilarious.
and when she said that, I was like, wow, you know, that's actually quite true. I was looking around, I was like, wow, this is like an assembly of super unhealthy people who ever think of themselves as superior
Yeah.
to the rest of the world, whoever is wildly more successful, wildly more healthy, and wildly more, let's say, grounded in a way, right? And this was one of those wake-up calls I had, like, something is really wrong in this esoteric world, because apparently you can find a niche for you and your other unhealthy loser friends, you know, to kind of give each other, you know, encourage each other that you're actually not such a loser like everybody else thinks around you. And you can create a little online community of people, you know, who kind of constantly pat each other's backs, you know,
Yeah.
and this way cope, you know, it's a coping
Yeah.
mechanism.
It
You
is.
know,
Yeah, it's self-masturbation at
that's
its
right. And
finest.
this is this is why, like, a lot of my associates, my people, I mean, they always are very concerned when we are too much out there, you know. They don't want to really be associated with the occult
Yes.
occulture,
Yeah.
let's say the wide occulture,
Yeah.
because, you know, there are so many lunatics and unbalanced crazies. They don't take the, you know, the people I work with, they take their spirituality really serious, you know,
Yeah,
and they're
because
very
it's your
engaged.
life. It's
It's your
your
life,
life, and that's the
exactly.
difference.
Plus they have a family, or they have a, you
Yeah.
know, a job which, you know, they're architects, or maybe they're
Yeah, of
professors, or
course.
whatever, you know,
Yeah.
or they're musicians, or you know, artists, or whatever, you know. But they do not need the esoteric, you know, as something they need to constantly flaunt in order to get much applause, because they do have a life that provides for social respectedness if
Yeah.
they need it. You know what I mean?
I know
So
exactly what you
they do
mean.
not have to be Lord Belial, or, you know, Grandmaster, you know, so and so, in
Yeah.
order to impress, you know, vulnerable women, or, you know, snuggle-toothed dudes, you know, to actually be somebody, right?
Yeah, no, yeah, I agree.
Like
Yeah,
and man, like attracts like, right? So
it
when
does.
we talked about it before we start recording, you know, when I choose podcasts that I do, you know, I do get a lot of requests, you know, through the year, and for me it's important I do it with people I consider serious, you know, not those, you know, who plainly and you know, just want to like flaunt their podcast senselessly, who haven't even read the book, or, you know,
Of
or
course.
want, like, you know, just freebies, and then they just have to do the podcast or something, you know.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I want people who only want to do the podcast with me because they find my work interesting, my work, my book interesting, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Why, you know, they should have a reason why they want to speak with me, and they should have an environment that I think is a valid environment for me to present my ideas, or to engage in conversation, because I don't like to engage just in polemics, or, you
No, of
know,
course not. Yeah.
having to face an audience which just want to hear pleasing things, which they hope, oh, David has said all those things I've already been thinking all my life myself, you know. Like the best things in my life, the best talks I've heard, the best books I've read were the books which literally collapsed my status quo, which I was thinking, like,
Oh yeah.
what is this guy telling me, you know, like, you know, he's telling me everything I don't want to hear, you
Oh
know.
yeah.
And then it kind of triggered a thought process. I could have said, like, that guy's full of shit, you
Yeah.
know. But like reading the first time Cosmogonic Eras by Ludwig Klages, where I was literally forced to abandon my entire course of esoteric direction I was taking, even though I was feeling I was making a lot of compromises, and I didn't know how I should get out of this, you know, this compromise making, and not really getting where I need to go. And people said, you invested so much in becoming the head of this or of that. How can you just turn your back on it voluntarily? You know, you've made a name for yourself, you know, you're famous, you know. And I said, like, well, even more reason maybe to do it, because I don't want to fall into that trap where, you know, I play to an audience, just for them to say, wow, David is cool. David is like, a cool occult rock star, like they used to label me, when I was,
Right.
younger.
I saw your
pretty,
pictures. I saw your pictures when you were young. I can see it.
Yeah. See, I'm that failed, sleaze rocker, turn occultist. So,
That's hilarious. That's hilarious. What I want to get to is I want to really, because everything you've kind of said has really led us into then the Black Pilgrimage itself, because in the world that we've been talking about, we are stuck in either all mind or all matter. But really, when we start to merge these things together from that Enlightenment thinking, we get back to what you're now stemming to call the Black Pilgrimage, or what you're talking about as the pandemonic. And so this book you were telling me beforehand kind of stemmed from a short little a talk and a short little thing that you were doing that Peter Mark Adams, the brilliant Peter Mark Adams, that everyone should go read all his work, because I feel like he's truly not only just a brilliant man, a gentleman and a scholar, but his work with the Game of Saturn and his Mithraic rituals and epiphanies is cutting edge, I think. But so he was the one who introduced me to you, and I find that he was exactly right. You and this book and your work and everything you've been saying is another setup for what I think the world needs to move into, is away from that dualistic thinking, away from subject-object separation, transcendentalism, and into this, what you're calling the pandemonic experience. Can you talk to me and everyone out here? Because I think this book is brilliant, but I also think that this is going to be one of those books that's really hard for people to understand, because of they're so indoctrinated into magic mind synthesis, instead of understanding that magic is the integration of yourself into the world that is trying to help you open up into the existential angst of what it means to experience existence as such. If that's a good lead in, I don't know, but
definitely. Well, I think everything we've said so far actually already speaks about the Black Pilgrimage.
I agree.
That was the good thing. So the book itself is the Black Pilgrimage itself is the alchemical movement away from the insulated personality and individual, which we have led to believe that we should be and that we are already through our heritage of Western thinking and rationalizing and approach to the world, something we do not actually consciously do, which we automatically do, by our mental faculties and the way they are employed in the world. The entire world is basically constructed to conform to this model, right? So we cannot escape it. Yep. So the Black Pilgrimage, and I think I've tried to actually phrase things pretty simple in the way that I do not make it so philosophical, but I make it very practical.
It's embodied prose, bro. I'm going to tell you this before you move on. It's embodied prose. Your prose is brilliant. It's beautiful. My girlfriend read the first little bit of it before I could get to it, and I had to be like, no, I have to read this. She loved it, and she is so hard to impress. So I just want you to know that.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks to her too. So it's what I hope with it is that people remain open when they read it. So if they remain open, like a spiritual mentor of mine, who is only a mentor of mine through lineage and familiarity of thinking, Alfred Schuller, he said, his words when he would give these strange talks that Rilke found so mesmerizing, said, his words are supposed to be erotic suitors to seduce people out of this rationalistic thinking. And however, I try to kind of wander the razor's edge of conceptually sound and understandable, while using a type of prose that will impact you emotionally as well, and in the soul. Actually, Jack Grail, whom you probably know by maybe reputation, he actually said the other day, it's the best occult book he's ever read. So that was high praise for me. Someone I take serious in his approach and in his work. The Black Pilgrimage to me is the alchemical movement from the insulated personality and individual that looks and experiences the world in a certain way, always trying to contain power, to exercise power, to shield himself or herself off from the influence that the world may have, to gain more and more autonomy in regards to shielding yourself from anything that you do not have control over. This is the world we live in, right? Oh, yeah. In any aspect of our lives. This is what we're taught to do. I believe the Black Pilgrimage to be the movement to understanding that when we live this way, it's a constant disappointing, frustrating, and also a life that makes us more poor in experience. It makes us more discontent in the world. It gives us the impression that we are content because we have control. And some people are more successful. So these are the people who have a lot of money, a lot of success, can play. And the rest is the little herd that tries so hard to do what these people do, but are not successful because they do not have that maybe manipulative power or luck, or family, money, or whatever it is, which sets some people, or cunning, or whatever it is, that the will to power of some people is not as strong, right?
Yes,
so the thing is, there is an alternative to this, an alternative where the world is not understood as a threatening opponent, a threatening object that, is constantly trying to fuck you over or fuck with you, or in its imperfectness is anathema to our idealism, because we believe in good and evil, in polarity. It's good or bad. It's perfect or it's not. What does this even mean? Perfect or good is something that we impose on the world. Is death good or bad? Is I don't know, violence good or bad? Depends on the context, I guess. Depends on, Germanic tribes would say, well, pillaging a village, or Vikings, which are so romanticized today, when they went out on a raid and burned down a village, raping everybody and taking everyone men as slaves that they didn't kill and children. Well, at least they had long hair and
we should worship Odin, is what you're saying? Is like exactly. This pagan worship of Odin?
Which also means human sacrifice and, hanging them in trees and stuff like that. Yeah. At least they had like long blonde hair and looked like, a cool biker dude, stupid stuff like that. So, or is there another way? Is there a way where even the tragedies, even the wounds, even the afflictions that we experience in our lives, the death of loved ones, health issues, having bad cards dealt, when we want to use this was wording, can we live a life where all these things must not be experienced as something that is essentially just bad, negative, and something that opposes our success and will to power? Is there a worldview where even these things can organically be integrated in our experience? Let's say I have a friend, one of the friends I respect a lot, Craig Slee, right? Who's who's written a book with Father Apter about Chthonic things, and a good friend of mine. He has strong disabilities, and he writes on disabilities issues and stuff like that. He, however, is also one of the most brilliant philosophers and a brilliant magician and a great cosmic Gnostic. Someone like him in the logocentric world would probably constantly feel disadvantaged. Like, why me? Why is this happening to me? Why am I having this?
A victim mentality.
And and everybody was like, wow, but that guy is one of the most ecstatic individuals I know. And it's not this kind of fatalistic ecstasy that's like, well, in the face of the whole fuckery, I'm just not. No, he is someone who has calibrated himself that even, the bad cards that he has been dealt with health-wise do not diminish his ability to ecstatically relate to the life current itself. because the life current itself is neutral. It's not good or bad. It's not a human. It doesn't conform to human-made categories of good and bad. Same as the spirit. They don't conform. An earth, like, or let's say a volcano that breaks out, and covers an entire city, can be from the other side of the bay, be a beautiful scenario. We're like, holy, it's like, I always have this idea, like, there's a famous German poet, I think was Stefan Georg, who said, or created this vision of Nero, the Emperor Nero, singing dithyrambics into the burning city of Rome because he was so enchanted by the vision of it, Yeah. So can the cruelty that we inevitably face, does this have to create in us the need to insulate us and create an artificial world where everything needs to conform to our standards of good and evil, of right or wrong, even though deep down knowing we can never manage this? It can never happen. The world will never be a perfect place the way we think. And worse is, like we said before, not everybody thinks alike. Not everybody thinks like what my perfect world is not the perfect world of an Islamic jihadist.
Yes, exactly.
And
exactly.
it's not the perfect world of Elon Musk or Donald Trump or Obama, whatever. I have everyone's ideal world is probably slightly different or vastly different. So we will always fail, and in the end, the world will overwhelm us in the end as well in death. And even now, people talk about us like postmodernism or post-postmodernism. We need to freeze our brains. We need to kind of like whatever.
Transhumanist.
Transhumanists, like the worst thing ever. It's
the worst thing ever.
It's the worst thing because it literally it's the logical consequence of Heidegger. It's a logical consequence of devaluing the flesh and blood experience, the slime, the guts, the shit, the semen, the vaginal fluids. It's the snot and the smut. It's the rejection of imperfection. And we need to learn that imperfection can be not glamorous, like some people try to, like, some perverted minds or some crooked minds say, well, this is like the most glamorous thing ever. Like, let's just revel in, blood and slime. It's also childish, but
that's Marina Abramovich and her nonsense. I would state is very much that realm.
This capitalizes on this, in a very commercial way, right? Yeah. So, however, the embracing of the imperfection of the world and the lessons we can learn from that. What does that mean? The ordinary world needs to be negotiated with. We need to come to terms with perishability, with mortality. We have to come to terms with things not working out. However, at the same time, opening us up in a way where even magical things can happen, right? We can have a bad time now, but when we are porous enough for the world and we have the magical technology, and I say in a living traditional world, this may not even be magical. It may just be the right calibration, the right working with the world, so that the disadvantage at one point can move into an advantage, or everything is in flow. Even the person, even who you are, is in flow, right? Black Pilgrimage makes a very, very, very big point by explaining that this idea of the monad, who we are, the defense of the conscious individual, which is so prominent in Western thought and in Western esotericism, is replaced by the idea of the constantly changing demonic self. And I say demonic as in a self that is never static, that is constantly changing according to what moves in and out of the inner wound, the inner self, the black hole that you have in yourself and which attaches yourself to the universe, and which we try to cement shut in order to remain insulated and defensible. The fortress that we have built, which, however, is never impenetrable, however we want it to be so, is an endless struggle which keeps us completely blinded to the ecstasy of the world that, however, comes with the price of imperfection. But the imperfection we seek in spiritual work or in our everyday life is an imperfection that only we project and that never happens, right? Yeah. Because otherwise, why is everybody so miserable? And why are even the saints? And I love to tell the story. There's the desert saint, who for 25 years or longer, 50 years, was, in the desert, one of the greatest saints of all. He said, like, everybody's worshiping. He's like, oh man, you're such a holy man. And then it's like, well, 50 years I've lived in the desert. 50 years I've tried to get my body under control and devote myself, to the Lord. But why do I dream every night of the whores in Rome? So every night the poor guy is tormented by sexual urges and has these horrible dreams, of sexual, good time. I'm thinking if that guy would have not wasted 50 years or 30 years in the desert trying to become holy and castigating the flesh, but engaged in the world, not as now we would have it here in the West again, as an individualized monad in this hedonistic way, that is just exploitative to yourself in the same time as well, because you objectify your body, you objectify your opposite, you objectify what you're engaging with. So even the libertines tend to objectify their body as the perfect object to sculpt and to be nice and cute and pump the lips and, pump the muscle, and at the same time objectify the people they engage with or the world engage with. It's the same problem here, right? But if you calibrate, if you understand that life is a negotiation with the world, and that who you are is a constantly changing organism that is made up of different components who are constantly in movement, then you arrive at a different idea of what a person is, a person of multiplicities. And once you understand that the world has that kind of character or atmosphere in themselves or in itself, in its phenomenological splendor. A tree, but not only tree, the forest. The tree has its character or atmosphere. The forest in which the tree is has its atmosphere. The valley in which that forest is located has an atmosphere, and they're all daemons. So there's the daemon of the individual tree, there's the daemon of the forest, there's the daemon of the landscape, there's the daemon of the mountain range, and if you look at the daemon of a valley, even that daemon, although it's the same valley, changes according to whether the sun's shining or whether there's a thunderstorm or whether there has been human intrusion into it and maybe, I don't know, making the river straight, and killing the natural slope of the river. So, what Heidegger called the fourfold, the constant mirroring and interpenetration of things, is what creates a world. And this is something that we have lost in experience. And when we talk about it rationally, some people would say, well, yeah, that sounds great. And it sounds even something, I should be investigating. But even to agree or to understand it rationally, there's still that need then to make it reality. And that's where, even in the Black Pilgrimage, the teacher comes in, the necessity of someone helping you to break open this insulation, because we constantly fall in the traps of, well, yes, I agree. That sounds like a good model. And I think it should look exactly like this. Or, oh, yes, now I'm open myself up to that. So immediately, however, we fall again into the trap of projection. And we need to learn very hard the simple things. Like Heidegger talked about, learning the simple. The simple is the most complicated, to allow the simple to move back into our awareness, to sit with the landscape and not only be enchanted by it on a superficial aesthetic level, but allowing the landscape to penetrate something so open that it transforms it. And that once you've sat with the landscape, it becomes a type of communication, but not a communication you force. Not, I'm going to sit today with the landscape and I wanted to tell its secrets, but to go there without a preconceived notion of what you're supposed to find. These are the first steps one can undertake, in order to try to bring a certain change to the way you confront life. And then later on, in later stages, once you've achieved the porosity of a certain level, you can calibrate yourself that this fluidity of of your personality and the impact the world has is not becoming destructive or random, because, you know, the world is violent, atmospheres are violent. If you're in the middle of a thunderstorm, or in the middle of a volcanic outbreak and you're not across the bay, it can be potentially fatal,
Oh, yeah.
So and every phenomenal experience that the world provides on every level is a daemon. So that is why in Haitian Vodou or in living traditions, violent things are spirits too, and they can be negotiated with. And in a place like Haiti that is ravaged by gang warfare and absolute anarchy, it has to be negotiated with. And people are not childish in Africa or other places, and they think like, oh, now I just make it spiritual and stuff like this. But you will see violence as a phenomenal daemon in a different way. Of course, the asshole who wields the gun and whips you over the head or shoots your mother or murders your child or something like this. That's not, you cannot talk about this in spiritual terms like, oh wow, this is such a great demonic experience, but it's violence as a demonic force, gone into an extreme, which has a very negative impact, and which you can negotiate with before, if you understand that violence in itself is a daemon. So you can yourself, like when I do magical rituals, I do not have a moral position where I cannot use magic to combat anyone. I can also, as we said before, magic to help you be more successful or get a job or something like this. This is not bad juju, bad magic. Of course, I don't think, the people who sell courses, for you to become a successful magician, the only people who are successful and make money are the people selling you the course, right? If they would be, they're selling it not because they're so nice. It's like, well, no. I've been so lucky that I've received all these powers and all these secrets, so now I feel obliged to give it to you. Well, then you have so much money by being so successful, give it for free.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And what an interesting thing is that most of the time, those people are thinking their right-handed path while they're doing something left-handed. Selling a course could be deemed a left-handed path when most of the time they're like, no, I'm a right-handed path magician. I only think about the theurgical understanding of apotheosis with God. And you're all like,
exactly.
But you're selling a course, right?
Exactly. So, I mean, this is of course, this is our culture, as it is established in a capitalist society, right?
Yeah.
You make it sound all holy and all lofty and all spiritual, but in the end, it's hard snake oil trading. It's hard work. You need to be better than your competitor, and then you shit upon the guy's fake. This one is an asshole.
Would you consider that Geist? Would you consider that the spirit? Because you have a dichotomy between the matter, the soul, those which are very, and then you have spirit. And a lot of times people would be like, well, why would, in the book, it's like spirit seems to be kind of like a anti-force, a negative understanding of it's the industrialized version of things. And so can you give a little explanation for the modern mind who doesn't really understand Hegel, Geist, and spirit?
Yeah. Right. So, I deliberately employ, like Ludwig Klages was the one who used these terms most prominently and most extreme, kind of inverting, the role that the spirit, and in German, Geist means on the one hand, the Holy Spirit, but it also means Geist as an intellect, or let's say the rational faculty, more than intellect, but also intellect plays in, but it's the rational, discursive, dissecting mental power. So it has in German a very precise but also broader echo, and I use it, I adopt it because I want people to rethink their spiritual orientation. Now their orientation in the Western world, right, spirit, is always the more positive, the more the spirit needs to transfigure the soul. The soul is that human element which needs to be purified by the spirit. And, the more and stronger your spirit is, or your connection with the uber spirit, the transcendental id, or whatever you want to call it, God's spirit, right, the more powerful your soul gets purged of all the imperfections which keep you chained to the imperfect world, your urges, your needs, and whatever. So by deliberately inverting the power stations here, by saying, well, we need to move away from what the spirit is. And even in spiritual traditions, of course, when you really think about it, and you are a philosopher, when you move the idea of spirit from, the Neoplatonists or Plato to the Neoplatonists to the modern traditions, the spirit always is that element of transcendentalism, that which is unchanging, pure, devoid of moral failure or what we as humans consider to be problematic. And it helps us to, move from one stage of human imperfection, to the next better stage. So we already have here moral implications of transcendence and of movement. And I try to invert these elements by actually observing what the word is. So what is actually defined as spirit in these traditions is what I consider to be problematic. The mental rational faculty, which has gone absolutely rampant and which has created its own fortress outside the world, which even I believe that the most ideas of God or transcendental, the transcendental realm, is literally a projection of the consciousness of human beings into the world. And now we see that this is collapsing. Now Nietzsche called the death of God. And what he did, he called that no longer are we even projecting our own ego or our own consciousness, our own form of consciousness into the sky, where we derive then at least a certain moral code, which then we orientate our lives to. Now this has been abolished. And now, it's only the human rational faculty and the will to power, which is supposedly giving us our moral obligation. And you have no more moral obligations except to your own will to power. So, so Nietzsche was the one who called it that we are moving from one stage into another. And the stage of the will to power is the much worse stage than where Allah or the good God, Father God, or in Buddhism, the transcendental dimensions are giving us a kind of moral code of behavior, which then is designed to make society functionable, and which of course changes with time according to sentiments, but sentiments of a consensus, and of course all the people who deviate from it are getting punished in one way or another.
Yeah.
So now the consensus is what? Capitalism. The consensus is our own individual striving. Nation. Now we get stupid stuff like, I hate nothing more also like patriotism, nationalism.
Yes.
These are all ersatz religions, which give the little person something to hold on to, something to feel good about.
It's that
when
master-slave dichotomy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we have a whole, rat's nest there to burn out. But it's all the can of worms there, right? So
it is.
So in my work, I use this since the soul is always considered the element of imperfection and of flawedness, that which anchors us in the world, and which makes us worldly in a sense, right? That element, to me, I try to explain it as this is the element which we have to empower. This is the element which we have to free from the stranglehold or the chokehold of that mental, rationalistic framework which we have created ourselves, the prison which we have created collectively and individually, and which is based also on the will to power, which in itself, like Heidegger said, we are living in a world where we think we have the most power and the most freedom, and at the same time we ensnaring ourselves deeper and deeper and deeper into enslavement. And in the end, like Ludwig Klages said, and with Heidegger in agreement, is we turn ourselves into larvae. like
Yes.
literal larvae, because by believing we create our own world and our own individuality, what we do is we ensnare ourselves deeper into that fantasy and projection, and what is left is an organism devoid of vitality, devoid of life, devoid of world.
Yeah,
So,
that's beautiful.
and you can see this in transhumanism, right? You don't
Oh
even want
yeah.
that anymore. You just want your mind in a computer,
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
more
Or
body, no more
a
nothing.
different skin suit that you can switch out that doesn't have any of your experiences. It leads you to being
Horrific,
just like a
horrific.
memory hole. It is horrific. Yeah.
And death as the worst possible threat hanging over us. And you think, once we've conquered this, see, it's the idea of conquer. Once we've conquered this, there's nothing that holds us back anymore.
Yeah.
So of course, however, in my work, and in agreement with Heidegger here, death can teach us many things. Yes. Death doesn't have to be the horrific end that we try to avoid, or that we embrace in a false sense of whatever comes after will be so great. We project something, the virgin in paradise, or being in cloud 9 with God and his angels, or in Summerland, or like some pagans. Oh, in Summerland, we're gonna be like in a kindergarten pagan world.
Shambhala, or fucking
exactly.
the New Jerusalem, right?
Right. So we either reject death, like the rationalistic transhumanists, which I prefer here, to these babyish, infantile creators of fantasy lands, which they like so strongly conjure, so the fate of death doesn't give them too much anxiety in their real life.
That's true. And that's the similar, and you're talking about the Atlantis worshipers, those who are all like, no, if like I transcend my body, mortal body, I will reach the new Atlantis and ascend to 5D reality. Exactly. And all that fucking nonsense, where it's all like, no, you need to get your own fucking life in order.
What I like about Heidegger is he said, like, maybe we are so lucky, and there will be a happy playground afterwards. The chances are extremely slim to not.
Extremely slim.
But Heidegger I would go as far as to not deny it, because that would make my whole idea of openness wrong. But I do not want to live according to a hopeful future that I, in my childish mind, project as the most desirable outcome. And funnily, there are so many afterlives and afterworlds, depending on culture and individual, and all look different, right? And then you're thinking like, shit, hopefully my model is the right one. Hopefully my model is the one that I believe the whole world will enter into, which even that, to an intellectual mind, is stupidity.
It's stupidity.
So
it becomes Pascal's wager of like, what am I going to do? How am I going to do it?
So this thing is, I, in my work, try to engage with what is, not with what I project as real, right? I see how the world works. And I learned this from Heidegger and from Ludwig Klages and from the living traditions. The living traditions do not project fantastic words. They see the harsh life as, they see death happening all the time. Like our ancestors did, like even a couple of 100 years ago, or even like 100 years ago, I don't know, every second child died in childbirth. So, I like to look at how is life? How does it impact us? What are the faculties of life which are in play here? And how can the individual in the modern world find its harmonious place? And when I say harmonious, I don't mean it in a sentimental way. I mean it as an integral way. How can we experience the world no longer as an enemy? We can experience aspects of the world as confrontational, but how can we no longer feel alien to the world? How can we no longer feel like the world is something out there and we are separate from it? And sometimes we're good with it if things go well, and sometimes and often we're at odds with it when it gives us a disease, a cold, a missed plane, or stuff like that, or a breakup or something, right? So how can we again feel so integrated in the world that the human being is no longer the exile that he has experienced himself to be for such a long time, since the times of the Platonic tradition, that we can return to a place where once the exile was felt first, it became more strongly empowered every generation until now. So I think there is a devolution in experience. It gave us more power over the world. It gave us great inventions, right? Firepower, computers, 1,000 models to conquer diseases. But it didn't give us more happiness. It didn't give us the feeling that the world, it more and more told us that we're different from the world. While at the same time reminding us every day that we're not, because we still suffer disease, we still suffer death, we still suffer a breakup that hurts us badly. We still are sad when we see someone suffering. We have all these human, worldly experiences which do not accord with the idea of we're separate and we're not part of it. And then then we project funny things like we are just a dream and the dreamer, it's not real, it's horrible. So how can we move back from there? The Black Pilgrimage is the move back from that isolation, that exile, in an inverted Gnostic transformation, basically, back from transcendentalism, which the Western schools want to, like you said, want to deepen, become more isolated, become more transcendental, become more detached, although knowing that you can, but don't worry if you're never perfect. Don't worry if anxiety, fear, and always creeps in. Even the greatest masters feel it. So from that escapism, that is a cowardice movement, which is natural to us because we have mimetically inherited it for so long, there must be a counter movement back into the embrace of the imperfections, the embrace of the world and seeing ourselves as an integral part. Of course, conscious, we're the only worldly thing that has a consciousness that can take a step back from itself, right? No other creature can do this. Even animals who can do it to a degree cannot do it to that degree. An animal can never wonder at a night sky full of stars in the Milky Way. An animal can never, contemplate a landscape like we can. So
it can't contemplate its own death,
contemplate its own death. So we are at the same time, and Heidegger beautifully put this, we are on one hand the part of the fourfold, the interplay of things within the world, but we're also the playing field on which that fourfold unfolds in its entirety, right? We are both part of the world and afflicted by it and afflicting it back, and we can do this harmoniously, and sometimes also violently, because we experience a certain violence from the world. So when we deal with certain aspects of the world, there can be a certain violence, I guess.
It has to.
And also the laws of magic. The laws of magic completely change in a paradigm that's based on projection, will. Right. Like Selima, for example, the basics of magic there are completely different from the basics on which magic happened in the living traditions, call it animist or whatever, but the true ones, not the ones that adopt the paradigm but then still work with rituals which are adopted from the Western tradition. Right. So it is a technology where you understand how to bear yourself in a way that the world responds, just as you respond to a rainstorm. When the rain, when you're in the middle of a thunderstorm, you will respond in a way, right? When the world impacts on you, you respond. So the world elicits a certain reaction, and we can make this reaction more harmonious, and we can create a rapport with a world that is more than shit. The world is impacting on me in an annoying way. Now I have no umbrella, or now why did it impact it? No, we can understand the way we interpenetrate each other in two fundamentally different ways, and also understand a way to interact with it in a different way. The people who really think they can change, let's say, something objectively in the outer world, by casting, your mental power upon the world, You know, I've never seen this work, never. And I used to make, yeah, you can see talks of mine from 15 years ago. I would be in England giving talks, and I would say, like, I ask sincerely the most powerful magicians in the place, put a death spell on me, please do. I want it to happen.
Please do. Yeah.
Please do, because I want to show you, you know, that it's not going to work, or do something to harm me. You know, I will be open to all the harm you can in your willful, powerful, magic minds put on me. Nothing will happen. Zero.
Of course not.
While I would never. While
Thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that. That's great. I agree 100%.
While I would hesitate to tell a Haitian magician or a Haitian priest or bokor or whatever, you know, to do the same thing, because then I would know I would have to probably defend myself against it, because that guy has a different way of dealing. There's also will involved, of course, when you want something to happen a certain way, but the will is not the decisive factor. The decisive factor is the way in which you connect to the phenomenal powers of the world, and then kind of like doing the right things so they move into the direction that you need it to. So the idea of what you're dealing with and how you're dealing with is fundamentally different.
The technology. And
the technology is very different. So, you know, so even that's that. Good. So you cannot be, let's say, you cannot adopt an animist or a polytheist worldview just by choice, and then, however, employing your same magical ways and stuff like that you've always employed, because they're two different paradigms. And also, we must understand that an animist today in some remote place, or 100 years or 200 or 2,000 years ago, experiences the world in a fundamentally different way than we do. He lived with the world and in the world in a different way. The world, the atmospheres of the world impacted him differently. His personality was more fluid. His sense of self was much less expressed in this individualistic way, right? His sense of self was weaker and more porous, which immediately now conjures the idea of, like, well, that's then a weaker thing. That's a worse thing, but it's not. We are having the bad end of it. The people with the weaker, so now in the modern world, unfortunately, the people who are still more porous, let's say tribal people, you know, unfortunately, in the world that's entirely based on the will to power, they'll get the stick end of it, you know, because they cannot defend against this concentrated, aggressive concentration of monadic will to power, which shows itself not in stupid magical tricks that never work, but they show themselves in inventions of bombs and machine guns and you know, capitalism of its extreme kind. You know, I'm not against capitalism, but capitalism in its extreme form. Of course. So what we need to do, and this is what Black Pilgrimage shows, is we cannot regress back to some type of you know, magical porous state where we live with the world. And again, this would be conjuring up a fantasy world, right?
It's a fantasy world.
We
need to move forward.
And we have consciousness, right? We have the consciousness, the rational consciousness and faculty, and it will never leave us again. Maybe there was a time, you know, 100,000 years ago where this wasn't, you know, so strongly developed or developed at all. You know, maybe at some point it developed in the brain, you know?
So Julian Jaynes is his old work, and
that's it. You know, that's what I was thinking about.
Bicameral mind.
Exactly. So, however, now what we could do is we can, Klages says it in a way, we can make the spirit, we can use the spirit against itself. We can empower the soul and still use the faculty of the spirit, but rather than the soul being imprisoned by the spirit, we need to imprison the spirit in a sense, to make it subservient to the soul, so that, you know, it kind of works in our favor. It's not going to be like a bad demon gone rampant and possessing us, you know. So now the metaphor I could give is like, now basically the entire Western world is possessed individually by a demonic force called the spirit, and this is creating a prison within ourselves, but collectively too, because we build a world that's based on its principles. And this world is a world of a devitalized experience and existence, which favors a few and disadvantages many. So, in my opinion, we can return to a porous personality where that faculty of reflection becomes that again, more of a reflection of a kind of, gardening, you could say, rather than imposing yourself upon the world in that exploitative way. We could become gardeners of the world, if you would say, right? Furthering life itself and understanding ourselves as an integral part of it. That sounds a bit romantic, but I just try to use a metaphor in order to give an idea of how a world could look like, where, a world is negotiated, and where we use our will to power to make ourselves take it back to a degree, not allow it to run rampant, not on people that we know. Also, I see relationships are so exploitative. People in relationships, it's always a struggle, like who can impose his will on the relationship more, who can conform to one's projection of the other better. Right. Even then, even if the relationship is great in some ways, but there's always that degree of like, who will make more compromise, who can manipulate better, and it's sad in that way. But where can we come to a world where even finding out that sometimes, relationships must go each own different ways again without feeling threatened, by the other person leaving, or when I hear things like, I go off on a tantrum now, but you have changed in a relationship, like, you've changed.
Of course I have.
I've met you like, 10 years, you're not the same person like you used to be. It's really irritating. And I'm like, well, why can we not come to a world where, we do not feel the change of another as a threat, but we can feel intoxicated while the demonic attraction works, both ways. And when, we feel that the other one and I are no longer that compatible, when they change in a way different from me and the needs become different or the attractions become different, how can we have created before a personality that doesn't feel that this type of movement away from each other is a loss and a betrayal? How can we come to a place where we can still be sad that the intoxications we felt are no longer there? But how can we stop then being so manipulated to try to force the other one to be like that again? And this is just an example from real life.
No, I think that's beautiful. I actually love that, because I think all of that you've been talking about this whole time, again, the Black Pilgrimage, amazing, but that gives to the saying that you have written in the book, the abyssus abyssum invocat, right? The deep calls to the deep. And I think that is so important, because it's one of those things where we're so afraid of the abyss, when really we need to understand that that abyss is actually at the very center of our own heart. And that black hole thing is what is connecting us to the rest of the world and the pandemonic itself. David, this is fantastic. I feel like I could talk to you, and I'm going to talk to you further in the future. We could talk. I think we could probably do an 8-hour podcast. I'm pretty sure.
I know. I see you already. We've been talking for so long. It's crazy. So, I hadn't felt like that, because it's so interesting. We both connect on so many levels, So of course, this could go on for hours, because,
beautiful.
We talk about things that come from the heart and experience. This is not learned knowledge.
It's not. No.
It is learned knowledge too, but it comes from a place of experience, and that is how you can actually identify a good teacher, for example. Someone who can talk about the work they do without having to resort to, phrases they learned by heart, or by I refer to the prophet, Alistair Crowley, or whoever other prophet, the scripture. But no.
Yeah, I agree, and so I feel honored. I so appreciate this conversation. So we're going to do this again in the future, whenever we so choose. Anytime. Whenever you've got, that's what I love to hear. So please, David, tell the people where they can find you, where they can get your work. Obviously, you own your own co-own your own press. What are the things that are coming up?
Well, as you just mentioned, I'm the co-owner of Theon Publishing. We do some very good books. People should check it out if they already haven't. Obviously, we have some very nice releases coming up as well. But at the same time, my work, or the work of the people in the current I work with, can be. We have a small website. It's called cosmicgnosis.com or theprimordialway.com. They can just Google it. It probably will come up. There's just a little bit of information, not much, because we don't really want to publish big things and publicize. But people who want to get in touch because they find like pilgrimage or this type of work so important as to maybe wanting to attempt to engage this type of things themselves and feel called to it more than just a pop cultural interest into making their life more fun or more glamorous. We're only interested to working with people on that deeper level, with people who feel a calling, basically, right? While I do hope that like pilgrimage, and that's why I released it as a book and not only disseminated to my students, although it was written basically and mainly for my students and the students who will come to our current. But I hope that people like you, of course, intelligent, open people can find a lot of connecting points and inspiration, and maybe, and that's what I hope the most, their status quo challenged, and some thinking to take place, which may move them to a different environment from the ones they've constantly been reinforcing and seen reinforced. So that's basically it. And I just hope that everybody has a nice time and a good time reading the book and enjoying it,
Yeah.
when they do.
Yeah, of course. No, that's fantastic. And I have, like I said, I'm myself, my girlfriend and I have both enjoyed reading it. It's an amazing book, everyone out there. It's gorgeous. The book itself, The Black Pilgrimage, this thing is so beautiful. It's only in comparison to Scarlet Imprints themselves, who also does amazing books. But yeah, Theon Press, like every book that I've bought from them is, I think I also, The Rituals and Epiphany I got of Peter Mark Adams' book. It's one of the most beautiful books I've ever held. And as a bibliophile, I just want to state that I am always looking, no matter where they're at, for these things that are like old arcane tomes that are really getting me in touch, because the pandemonic is within, even when I read something, the smell of the book, the feel of the book, how I highlight the book. And so I just want you to know that.
That's great to hear. I'm going to actually pass it on to my co-owner, Jessica. She's actually in charge of the typesetting and the layout, and she does a great job. So thank you for saying that. Yes. That is very important to us as well, because it's part of the entire presentation. The inner and the outer should fuse and, give it one demonic impulse, you could say.
Oh, I like that. No, that's exactly it. And it definitely does that. And just so you know, I'm telling everybody about Theon Press and your work, David. And so I appreciate you just writing something that I can be impressed by. Not that I'm anybody, but more like I'm just always trying to grasp for more.
You're the type of person I've written the book for, basically. Someone who's open and, can appreciate things when they find them to be of sound and deep quality. So thank you.
You're welcome. Well, thank you for coming on to Magus in the Media, David. I appreciate it so much. And again, we will do this again. And everybody out there into the world that is listening, make sure, if you haven't already, to subscribe, like, and share to Magus in the Media. Head over to Theon Press, head over to Cosmic Gnosis, buy their books. The only way technically we can help battle the Geist, the spirit, and those evangelical and fundamentalists on either side is to make sure that we help the community that is actually trying to give us that impulse of the pandemonic, just like this one. And so everyone have a beautiful day, and we will do this again. And until next time.